Men think about the Roman Empire at least 5 times a day. Me personally, I think about it once every minute, but that's only because I'm currently recording a video about the Roman Empire. Well, technically, I'm currently writing the video, but by the time you see this, I won't be making a video about the Roman Empire at all. The point is, what is the Roman Empire? When did it start? And when did it fall? Today, I'll be going over the first of those questions in an attempt to answer who was the first Roman emperor. Rome, as a nation, started when two boys were raised by what is generally translated as a she-wolf, but could also be referring to a prostitute, and grew up to found a city in 753 BC on the Palatine Hill. Well, one of them wanted to found it on the Aventine Hill, which went poorly for him, which is actually what my channel icon is a reference to. Anyway, they named the city Rome, and he crowned himself Romulus Rex, and so began the Roman kingdom, which lasted for 250 years. That was until one king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, was too much for the people to bear. Don't be fooled by false cognates, the superb in his name means nothing good. They deposed him and established a brand new Roman Republic and proceeded to let him live for 15 years before he died of natural causes. The Roman Republic was absolutely petrified of one man gaining too much power. It had a huge senate, 4 assemblies, and 2 consuls, both of whom had veto power, and only served for 1 year. In its earliest days, Rome continued to extend more rights to the plebeians, adding 5 tribunes of the people, all with veto power, who all served 1 year terms. While Rome is busy waging Punic wars, expanding, and getting sacked by the Gauls and the Greeks, let's talk about the definition of an empire. The best definition of an empire is an area of land ruled by an emperor, but that begs the question, what defines it? Well, another definition thrown around is that an empire is a large, diverse state, all controlled by a single ruler. Some say it has to do with the federalism of it, but I'll switch between these definitions over the course of this video. I'm just going to give the history, and you can make your own judgments. Anyway, now that Rome's done cooking, we can jump back in. The year is 133 BC. The plebs have just elected a new tribune of the people, and he goes by the name of Tiberius Gracchus, and he has a radical idea to set a maximum amount of wealth and for the government to seize any excess land and redistribute it among the people. Pretty Hegelian so far. If this sort of thing was proposed in the US, well, first of all, it wouldn't work because billionaires would just move to a different country, but the rich people in the Senate would block it from passing. Unfortunately for the rich people in Rome's Senate, Tiberius Gracchus just realized that he technically doesn't need to go through the Senate. Surely someone can stand up for the rich people, though. Well, his fellow tribune Marcus Octavius vetoed him, so Gracchus used his veto power to shut down the government, and when Octavius refused to give in, Gracchus proposed a bill that Octavius should be removed from office. I know what some of you are thinking, and no, he can't just do that, but it doesn't matter because the assembly voted for it. The remaining tribunes all supported Gracchus. One of the consuls was busy fighting a war in Sicily, and the other one quietly supported him, so the legislature passed. So the question becomes, was Tiberius Gracchus the first Roman emperor? Well, probably not. For one thing, all he did was pass a single bill, and maybe be unconstitutional once. And more importantly, that was because he was a populist. If leveraging sheer populist energy to pass a single unconstitutional act counts as being an emperor, then Andrew Jackson was an emperor. I'm sure some people would make that argument, but more to the point, that very same year, Tiberius was beaten to death with chairs and thrown in a river. His younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, continued his legacy in 123 BC, expanding his land bills, weakening the power of the Senate, organizing new territories, and taxing the heck out of them. He then used that money on infrastructure that would benefit the merchant class. Even though he was incredibly powerful, I think you know I'm going to use the same arguments against him, especially since he lost re-election in 121 BC. But the Gracchus brothers were just the sparks. The flame was to be a man named Gaius Marius. Marius won the consulship in 107 BC and strong-armed the public assembly into making him general of all the forces in Africa, again bypassing the Senate. He also opened the military to all, not just the upper class. After Rome suffered defeats in the north and victories in Africa, Marius was placed in charge of all of it. After a crushing victory, he established laws to repay all of his veterans with land with the help of Saturninus, a tribute. So was Marius the first emperor of Rome. He certainly set the precedent that the Roman military high command and consulship were to be intertwined. He was incredibly powerful and probably could have been the emperor, but he moved too quickly. Saturninus organized an assassination, and when Marius was forced to give him up to be imprisoned and ultimately lynched, the Senate voided all of his laws. Marius, disgraced, fled into exile. So perhaps populism is not the way to become an emperor. Maybe you have to appeal to where the money is. Enter Cornelius Sulla. In 88 BC, a war broke out in what is now eastern Turkey. The Senate wanted to send Sulla to quell it, but the tribunes wanted to send Marius. So he crossed the Rubicon. Well, actually, he never left the Rubicon, but the point is he invaded Rome and forced the government to give him the job. While he was busy fighting that war, Marius returned and took power by force, slaughtering those loyal to Sulla. But his army was no match for Sulla's when he crossed the Rubicon. Well, technically, he approached Rome from the opposite direction as the Rubicon. He entered, purged the government of anyone loyal to Marius, declared himself dictator, reversed every law that the Gracchus brothers and Marius passed, and established a system where if you wrote your name on a list, then everyone in Rome tried to kill you. We're not sure how he died, but I'm pretty sure that worms grew in him because he drank too much wine. So, was Sulla the first Roman emperor? Well, he's certainly the strongest candidate so far. The man was essentially a miniature Stalin. He consolidated all power in himself, nobody in Rome was able to stand up to him, and he was more or less a military dictator. But the biggest reason that most people don't consider Sulla a Roman emperor is because Sulla's Rome wasn't part of the Roman Empire. In other words, if it was an empire under Sulla, it didn't stay one for long. It all began with a name you know, Spartacus. Slavery had been outlawed in ancient slavery of other Romans had been outlawed in Rome for nearly 300 years, and Sulla had brought it back. That went about as well as you might expect, and a massive slave revolt broke out, the Third Servile War. Rome's army at this time was in decline, but who had come to invigorate it? That's right, the wealthiest man in history up to this point, Marcus Crassus. He crushed the main army of the rebellion, and Gnaeus Pompeius, who wants you to call him the Great, managed to take out the last stragglers. Together they marched to Rome and demanded the consulship, and proceeded to undo everything Sulla worked for, even though they were technically his men. But these two would resurface as potential emperors when they met one man, the Pontifex Maximus, who would change everything. One man who towered above the rest, not just in his time, but even now. One man whose last name has literally become synonymous with the word emperor across all of Europe. I don't even need to say his name. He's the honorable, the magnificent, the triumvirate didn't really kick off until 59 BC when Pompeius divorced his wife and married Caesar's daughter. In Caesar's first term as consul, he pushed through more land bills to distribute public land to veterans and families with 3 or more children, as well as reducing taxes on the poor. When his co-consul Bibulus tried to resist, Caesar and his men essentially bullied him out of the job. And unlike Marius, after his consulship, Caesar stepped down instead of running again, instead becoming governor of Gaul. Pompeius stayed in Rome, wrangling the government to the triumvirate's interests, and Crassus went out east. Caesar's military exploits against the Gauls and Germans are the stuff of military legend and only elevated his status further. Pompeius's political exploits were much less exciting and not worth mentioning. Crassus failed so hard in Syria that he died. Pompeius's wife, Caesar's daughter, also died, and the triumvirate had completely fallen apart. Pompeius, along with the Senate, then stripped away Caesar's military and political titles and told him to return to Rome in shame. Caesar, of course, oh, you already know what he did. He crossed the Rubicon and invaded Rome. He pushed Pompeius out of Rome all the way to Egypt, where he destroyed his army. In his absence, the Senate was forced to declare Julius Caesar dictator for life. Caesar exercised massive power in this position, single-handedly reorganizing much of Rome, with the Senate fundamentally unable to stop him. Well, legally at least. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, Caesar was stabbed to death by a senatorial mob, and the tyrant of Rome finally died. So, was Julius Caesar the first Roman emperor? Well, he was certainly the first in a long tradition that almost certainly evolved into an emperor, perhaps even during his lifetime. But first, we have to address one of the answers to who was the first Roman emperor. An obvious answer is whoever was the first to take the title emperor. And therein lies the problem. None of the Romans called themselves emperor because they spoke Latin, not English. There are 4 good candidates for the equivalent of emperor: Imperator, Augustus, Princeps, and Caesar, but I suppose it doesn't really matter because it was Caesar's immediate successor who took all of them. After Caesar's death, the Senate expected the people to rejoice that the tyrant was dead. They did not. Marcus Antoninus gave a rousing speech, and the people murdered the Senate. A man named Cicero attempted to use Gaius Octavianus as a pro-Senate general to crush the 2 pro-Caesar consuls, Marcus Lepidus and Marcus Antoninus. Instead, the 3 joined together into the second triumvirate, returned to Rome, and crushed the Senate. They then divided Rome equally, and by equally I mean Octavianus got the left half, Antoninus got the right half, and they decided Lepidus wasn't really part of the triumvirate anymore. As a blessing of goodwill, Antoninus married Octavianus' sister. The falling out was mostly Antoninus's fault. He divorced his wife and married Cleopatra, which meant that since Cleopatra got her claim to power by literally being the goddess Isis, he had to be the god Osiris. Now, the Romans didn't have a problem with being a god. Octavianus was already calling himself Divi Filius, the son of God, but they did have a problem with him being a Greco-Egyptian god. When it was discovered that his will stated that he was to be buried in Egypt, even if he died in Italy, it was too much for the Octavian half, and they declared war. After a decisive victory, Octavianus returned to Rome and symbolically gave all of his power back to the Senate, which they symbolically gave right back to him. He then declared himself Caesar, Imperator, Augustus, Princeps, made himself personal leader of 5 of Rome's provinces, and was elected as consul for 8 straight years. He then gave up the consulship and became tribunician, where he gave himself the power to veto proposed legislature and call the Senate to meeting. These powers, along with personal command of his provinces, lasted for life. He then gave himself consulship for life. When Lepidus died, he became Pontifex Maximus, and finally he became Pater Patriae, father of his country. When he died, all of those titles were passed to his heir. And so Rome had completed its journey to being an emperor. But one of these titles still leaves an open question. What does Caesar mean? As I've said, Caesar became synonymous with emperor, and Octavianus was the first to take that title. But Caesar himself didn't have a chance to take that title. He was born with it. Obviously, it didn't mean anything in his time, so we have to ask, why did Octavianus take it? Perhaps he was conceding that it was Caesar who was the first Roman emperor. It's also likely that it was related to his Divi Filius title, because Caesar had been deified a couple of years earlier. And also, he was adopted by Caesar according to his will. But the Senate doesn't just declare some random consul to be a god, and any way you slice it, Augustus was relying on being Caesar's heir. Which brings me to my main point. Julius Caesar was almost certainly the last of the Republic, but was he first of the Empire? Well, you can make a lot of arguments about definitions, but most importantly, first of the Empire would directly translate to the title Princeps, which was only held by Emperor Octavianus and those following him. Oh, and also, Caesar doesn't die at the end of his play. His death happens slightly before the midpoint, and the remainder is devoted to the ensuing power struggle.